Dr. Alon Burstein is standing by with some handy-dandy maps behind him now. Alon, it's good to see you. Is this the first time the U.S. has talked directly with Hamas?
It's good to see you, Austin. Yes, this is the first time that the United States at least has openly admitted that it is talking directly with Hamas. It's important to put this within context. Hamas was defined as a foreign terror organization by the United States since 1997. Now, officially, the United States, like Israel, like most Western countries, are not allowed to talk to terror organizations. At the same time, we do know that there have been negotiations between the United States and organizations like the Taliban. We've seen negotiations between the United States and other organizations. Usually, however, this is done through mediators. Usually, this is done like Israel negotiates with Hamas. It doesn't talk directly with Hamas. Israel talks to Qatar, it talks to Egypt, then they go and talk to Hamas because Israel refuses to talk to them. What is unique about this is that the United States pretty much openly is saying that they are talking directly to the leaders of Hamas that are in Qatar. This has also been confirmed by Hamas itself. Sources have been quoted in Al Arabi Al Jadid, in the Saudi newspapers, and Al Sharak and others. All have said that they are talking directly to the United States about specifically those hostages that remain in the Gaza Strip that have U.S. citizenship. One of those hostages is alive, Idan Alexander. There was a life sign of him. Hamas published a video of him by now almost 100 days ago. But there are other bodies of other hostages, at least 4 more, that have U.S. citizenship. That is what's being focused on. What is very important also is the specific wording of what has been said. It is not being said that these negotiations are about simply releasing these hostages or that one live hostage and the return of the bodies of the other hostages. It is within the broader framework of a bigger deal that the United States is trying to pressure Hamas to possibly move the release of Idan Alexander and those bodies of hostages with U.S. citizenship forward in exchange for a larger implementation of phase 2 of the deal, which I remind everyone involves a complete ceasefire and idea of withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. And that is something that is very much going to anger Israel if that is actually implemented and the U.S. ends up forcing Israel into that phase of the deal.
How might Benjamin Netanyahu feel about the U.S. speaking directly with Hamas?
So the United States, so Israel is very careful in how it is relating to the United States. We spoke about this a few days ago when we were comparing the Netanyahu-Trump relationship to the Zelensky-Trump meeting. And one of the things that we talked about there is that contrary to Zelensky, who came to the White House but was referring to past negotiations between the United States and Ukraine, and Trump brushed him off and said, yeah, that wasn't with me, right? That was with a different administration. Netanyahu realizes this. Netanyahu realizes that first and foremost, as a leader of a country, you have to stay on Trump's good side. It has nothing to do with past agreements between the countries. It has nothing to do with the relationship between the countries. What matters is the interpersonal relationship between the sides. Because of that, when the Israeli Prime Minister's office was asked, so what do you think about this? Israel was very careful. It did not say that it is against these negotiations, which it is against. It did not say that it does not want to be compelled into phase 2, which it does not want to be compelled into. All it said was that very, very, very sort of abstractly, Israel related to the United States its feelings on these negotiations. That is the statement that was made out of Israel. Not pro, not against. Israel has conveyed its message. That's very different than what we've seen in the past. In the past, whenever Trump has said anything about the war, Israel's come out in full support. Whenever Trump has said that there has to be a hostage deal and a truce, Israel's come out in support. Whenever Trump has said there has to be the complete evacuation of all Palestinians from the Gaza Strip, Israel's come out in support. Usually, Israel is in full support of anything the Trump administration does. This time, Israel simply said it has conveyed its opinion. Very, very likely, what we are going to see within Israel's prime minister's office is a lot of fear. One of the things that we've mentioned several times, while Israel very much relies on the Trump administration to be on, quote unquote, its side when it comes to the Israel-Hamas war, that is, you cannot rely on that entirely, because Trump will do whatever he feels is in his best interest, the United States' best interest, the interest of ending the war. And while that up until now has aligned with Israel's interests, if at any point we see that that deviates, much like we saw in Russia-Ukraine, likely we will see Trump starting to compel Israel into something that Netanyahu may not want.
We're taking a live look at Gaza right now. We know that the person who's been speaking on the White House's behalf to Hamas is Adam Boehler. He's the presidential envoy for hostage affairs for the Trump administration. He's been speaking with Hamas officials in Doha in recent weeks. You follow leaks, Alon. Did they successfully keep this under wraps until now? Did they keep it a secret?
So there's been a lot of rumors about these negotiations, but until now it hasn't been made official. One of the reasons it hasn't been made official is because both sides likely would have had an interest in it being kept quiet. On the one hand, the United States has been saying, Trump openly said that as far as he's concerned, right, weeks ago already, Israel can do whatever it wants. It can violate the agreement. It can go back to war if all the hostages were not released by that famous Saturday afternoon where they were not released. On the other hand, the United States Special Envoy to the region, Steve Witkoff, also asked Israel to not violate the truce. There are even leaks right now that he has asked Israel to keep the truce going, even though right now, officially, phase one is over. There is no negotiations over phase two. So technically, the ceasefire is right now over. Yet somehow it is just being passively maintained. According to reports, Steve Witkoff has asked Israel to just maintain it until he comes to the region. He was supposed to come to the region last week. That was delayed to this week. He's not coming this week. Now it's being delayed until next week. So the United States has had an interest in sort of keeping things under wraps just in order to leave the ceasefire alive. And seemingly, despite Trump's statements, the United States has an interest in keeping the negotiations ongoing, but they wouldn't have wanted to be made public that there are these negotiations on the side. Similarly, Hamas has been demanding that Israel implement phase two of the agreement. According to the initial agreement that was signed back in January, there were supposed to be negotiations between Israel and Hamas. Those negotiations were supposed to lead to an implementation of phase two and a complete ceasefire and IDF withdrawal. And Hamas has said, we're not renegotiating. We're not renegotiating an extension of phase one like Israel has wanted. We're not renegotiating a new framework that Israel proposed, that they said the United States has proposed for some sort of further implementation of phase one or what Egypt might have proposed. Hamas is saying, we want phase two and that's it. So they also would have had an interest in things being kept under wraps. So until now, there's been a lot of rumors, but nothing quite confirmed. And now, seemingly, I think possibly because the negotiations aren't going anywhere, both sides, the United States and Hamas, all of a sudden saw a different interest. They said, you know what? Let's pull the cap off this. Let's openly say, if Israel's not going to negotiate and implement phase two, just so you know, there might be side negotiations going on that will cut you out of the deal. Again, somewhat reminiscent to the United States talking to Russia, trying to some extent compel Ukraine, saying, come into the deal because otherwise, FYI, negotiations may happen sort of over your head and end up forcing you into a deal that you don't have a say in it.
Okay, so on the Trump side of things, the president did put out, and I'm sure you've seen this by now, Alon. So he put out this statement on Truth Social. I'm going to read it verbatim. Shalom Hamas means hello and goodbye. You can choose. Release all of the hostages now, not later, and immediately return all of the dead bodies of the people you murdered, or it is over for you. Only sick and twisted people keep bodies, and you are sick and twisted. I'm sending Israel everything it needs to finish the job. Not a single Hamas member will be safe if you don't do as I say. I have just met with your former hostages whose lives you have destroyed. This is your last warning. For the leadership, now is the time to leave Gaza while you still have a chance. Also, to the people of Gaza, a beautiful future awaits, but not if you hold hostages. If you do, you are dead. Make a smart decision. Release the hostages now, or there will be hell to pay later. Alon, strong language. How has the Middle East reacted to it?
So far, we have not seen a lot of reactions to this, to be honest, because most of it is being taken, I would imagine, as the same type of rhetoric that has been said before. Trump already said, again, several weeks ago, all the hostages have to come back by that famous Saturday at noon, or there will be hell to pay. Nothing changed as far as the deal was implemented. Then there was, again, the release of other hostages and the way they looked, and also the uncovering of the way the Bibas family was murdered. And again, Trump said there will be hell to pay. And he's also openly then added to that, and Israel can do whatever it wants as far as I'm concerned. So again, in public at least, like I said, possibly behind the scenes, the United States is telling Israel something different. But in public, it has already all been said. So theoretically, there's nothing new here. Moreover, this notion that Trump is giving Israel everything it needs in order to finish the job, that also is not a game changer. Despite all the rhetoric about how the Biden administration withheld weapons shipments to Israel, those weapons shipments had nothing to do with the way the war was being implemented. Those were specific bombs that were over 1-ton bombs They were only held up after Israel had already invaded Rafah back in May of 2024. They had nothing to do with the way Israel was fighting in Gaza, actually had a lot more to do with the way Israel was fighting in Lebanon. Trump administration, while it has released all of the holdups from the Biden administration, the releasing of more weaponry is not giving Israel any more of an edge against Hamas than previously had. What may happen if the war does reignite, if the violence does reignite between Israel and Hamas, and the IDF expands its occupation of the Gaza Strip beyond the buffer zone where it is now, we might see a different response from the administration. We might see no restraints placed on Israel. Already, we've seen Israel has stopped all humanitarian aid coming into Gaza from the last 3 days, and the administration has not said anything. So, in that sense, the rhetoric is different from the Trump administration. But in terms of actions, when it comes to weaponry, when it comes to what Israel might do to Hamas in response to this, the hell that's going to rain down on Hamas in response to this, chances are this is being read as another threat, credible or not credible. It's another threat coming out of President Trump, but it's not different than the threats that have been leveled at Hamas if they don't release hostages from the last several weeks that have not produced results thus far. So I predict that we're not going to see a big response to this latest threat, just like we've seen to the other ones.
I want to ask you about the hostages that have been released. We've been looking at this footage of some of them meeting with President Trump in the Oval Office today. What have we learned from these hostages alone? What have we learned about where they were kept, what conditions they were in, and how Hamas managed to keep them away from the IDF for all that time?
We've learned some horrendous stories about the conditions that hostages were kept in. Mostly what we've learned I'll try to divide it up into like several things. We've heard a lot of testimonies from the different hostages. When it comes to how Hamas kept them from the IDF, mostly what we've heard is that Hamas moved some of the hostages from place to place, and that a lot of them were kept underground, but never in a single location. Some of the hostages were moved. Keith Siegel, I believe, said that he was moved over 33 times to different locations in the
Wow.
Gaza Strip, sometimes held in apartments, sometimes held in tunnels as the IDF advanced to different places. Each time they moved to a different place. Other hostages said they were held in one place and never saw the light of day. So each hostage was treated differently, and that's one of the advantages that Hamas has had in holding the hostages. They really broke it down into several different units of captors that were holding hostages. And those captors really had sort of free reign when it comes to how they maintain the hostages. That is one of the reasons that we've seen some of the hostages coming back looking in very, very big, quote unquote, good condition or okay condition in the sense that they came back not seemingly starved or beaten. They were held captive, obviously, for almost a year and a half. I'm certainly not saying they were treated well, but did not look as bad as some of the hostages that came back that looked like they had been starved and beaten and tortured. And the reason is that these different captors, sort of each one of them had their own autonomy with regards to how they maintained the hostages. Something that I will say though that has been, I'll say, interesting from the way it is understood, at least with regards to what Hamas is saying about the hostages. Some of the hostages did report that every time there was the less humanitarian aid entered into the Gaza Strip, there was less food that entered the Gaza Strip. They did in fact receive less food, and they were under intense conditions of hunger and sometimes starvation. Does that mean that Hamas didn't have food to give them or was punishing them with hunger and starvation as a weapon of war? That I don't know, that they don't know, but they did report that. They also did report that their captors, almost all of them, were very attuned to the news. They were very attuned to the news, and when there was inflammatory rhetoric that was issued from the United States or from Israel, for example, when Israel's former Minister of National Security, Tamar Ben-Gvir, made public announcements that Palestinian prisoners were going to start being treated worse in Israeli jails, some of the hostages reported that in response to that news report, they were taken aside and beaten by their captors repeatedly for days in some, sort of sick retribution to that. So what we learn from that is that a lot of the rhetoric that comes around the war that we think is just part of the warlike mentality ends up having an effect on the ground, on the hostages themselves. Also, it's just something else to take into consideration when we see the way leaders are talking and how negotiations are happening. What is leaked, what is not, what they say has a direct effect on the hostages that are still in the Gaza Strip.
So, we've asked our audience today if they have any questions about these wars. This is one sent in from Carson in Pennsylvania. They ask, what's the chances of Trump sending U.S. troops in to get hostages if Hamas does not comply with his orders? Alone, this is an idea that would sound pretty far fetched, but with some of the rhetoric that we've been hearing directly from the president, I'll put this statement back up. It ends with, there will be hell to pay later. Is this a wild question to ask at this point? What are the chances that U.S. troops could actually be sent into Gaza?
First of all, I'll say that I like the innovation of asking people to send in questions. I think it's good, thought provoking.
Thank you.
It's a very good question. I do not think that it is very likely that we will see this happen. We might have seen it happen with a different administration, whether Democrat or Republican, specifically the Trump administration. Trump views most of his geopolitics through a business lens. The geopolitics is not viewed through the lens of alliances, ideological connections, even cultural connections. It is viewed through the lens of business. The United States is funding most of NATO. Why should the United States be paying most of NATO, be sending troops to NATO? That's a European problem. Let Europe pay for it. Same goes with US aid. Same goes with looking at Panama and Greenland. All these things are not looked at through necessarily previous alliances or democratic countries, democratic peace, things like that. They're all looked through a business lens. And through a business lens, sending troops in to war is not a smart move. It's never a smart move. There are very, very few, if any, lucrative wars that have happened, certainly in the last 100 years, but absolutely in the last 50 years. Wars cost money. They end up being detrimental when it comes to plundering your resources. Ultimately, it is not worth it. And that is one of the reasons that we are seeing Trump, before he even took office, pressuring Israel into an agreement with Hamas. We're seeing him pressuring Ukraine into an agreement with Russia. Trump does not want the United States to be embroiled in more wars. I think that he would be happy to send whatever he can to help get hostages out of the Gaza Strip, and certainly U.S. citizens that are held hostage out of the Gaza Strip, much as he will be happy to send drones to attack the Houthis in Yemen. We've seen the Trump administration recently declare the Houthis again a terror organization. I think he's certainly on the side that would like to fight Hamas and the Houthis. At the same time, I very much doubt that we'll see him actually sending troops in. He would like to avoid getting the U.S. embroiled more into wars and stay out of them.
Yeah, and of course, we've heard so much coming from that side saying that they want to keep America out of some of these conflicts. I want to ask you, because we've hit a lot today, but before we go, we got to talk about phase two. Has there been any inching closer to some sort of agreement to begin the next phase of the ceasefire? From everything I've read, they're still abiding by most of the rules of the initial phase. We're not seeing any fighting happening in Gaza in real time. But phase two is ultimately what would bring us closer to releasing the rest of the living hostages and an end to the war itself. Has there been any progress on phase two?
The short answer is no. Ultimately, what was supposed to happen is on day 16 of the truce, so that's at the beginning of February, they were supposed to begin the negotiations on phase two. And phase two includes a declaration of an end to the war, IDF withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, the release of all hostages in exchange for an undetermined amount of Palestinian prisoners. Now, negotiations, first of all, didn't start until almost the last week of phase one. And then right now we're in a state of limbo. According to the initial agreement, the way it was supposed to work, as long as negotiations on phase two continue, then all the terms of phase one continue as well. So the truce between the sides is supposed to continue. The entrance of humanitarian aid is supposed to continue. Israel is still supposed to abide by its initial obligations, and that was that on day 42, which was last Saturday, Israel was supposed to begin its evacuation of the Philadelphia corridor, that is the border between Gaza and Egypt over here. And on day 50, by March 9th, Israel is supposed to complete that evacuation. Now, what has happened is, until now, the truce has been largely maintained between the sides. There's been a couple of minor violations here and there, but nothing big. Other than that, we've actually not seen the sides live up to the deal. Israel has cut off all humanitarian aid as of Sunday that's coming into the Gaza Strip, so it's not abiding by the idea that that will continue, and has not withdrawn from the Philadelphia corridor. That said, one could argue that Israel is not in complete violation of the deal since negotiations are not happening right now. The deal said so long as negotiations happen over phase two, then the truce is maintained. Now negotiations aren't happening, so theoretically, almost Israel is acting on good faith that it is not returning to war, but isn't beholden to living up to the other sides of the deal. So you could argue from both sides who is at fault, so to speak, over violating the current agreement. What we are seeing now, however, is a very bizarre limbo state. Negotiations over phase two are not happening. There are no delegations that are scheduled to meet. Egypt has put forward its own proposals. Steve Witkoff might have put forth his proposal. He didn't announce it, but Israel said that it's accepting that proposal and that Hamas rejected it. Hamas said they would never propose, they would never offered it. A lot of people are saying a lot of things. What is not happening, Israel and Hamas are not speaking to each other. They're not speaking to the negotiating sides. Everyone is seemingly waiting for maybe what will happen when Steve Witkoff comes back to the region. Maybe everyone's sort of tacitly waiting out Ramadan, which started a few days ago, that is a month. And maybe everyone's waiting for Passover. It's another very tense time that's going to be in the middle of April. Something that's also just important to float out there. I believe Washington Free Beacon published a report several days ago that quoted several anonymous Israeli sources who were stating that Israel's plans are to return to fighting, to very intensive fighting, 6 weeks from when that was published several days ago, which not coincidentally would be after Ramadan and right at the end of Passover. So possibly also we're seeing this sort of tacit both sides waiting and gearing up, but really everyone's kind of waiting for what happens when Trump says, okay, so I'm now actually telling Israel, go back to fighting, let's see what happens. Or I'm actually telling Israel, no, I'd see you implementing phase two. Up until now, Trump has said both things. Really, I think depending on which way the president leans, we might end up seeing the sides somehow conforming. Remains to be seen.
Let's see that one more time. Give us an idea of where the Philadelphia corridor is. That was southern Gaza, correct?
Southern Gaza. This is the border between Gaza and Egypt. And this corridor is something that Israel fought very hard in order to maintain. It was a smuggling area between the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza. That was one of the ways that Hamas really armed itself over the years. Right now, the IDF is deployed along that border. Egypt has complained about that. Palestinian factions and Hamas have complained about that. The IDF was supposed to withdraw. Until now, it is still maintaining its position there. The Rafah crossing is open, so there is some movement of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip out to Egypt, but the IDF still maintains all of its presence on that border.
Introducing audience questions and a map behind Alon Burstein today. Alon, good to see you. Alon uploads his own Middle East updates on his personal YouTube channel. Give him a follow. Alon, as always, good to see you. Have a good night.